If you've ever had a zucchini plant go from super healthy to absolutely destroyed in 24 hours, yeah, I've been there. And today I'm going to share with you just a couple tweaks that you can make to make sure that you have nice, healthy, beautiful squash. Hey guys, I'm Katrina with Homegrown Florida. The very first tweak we need to do is pests. So let's open our book. If you haven't gotten this yet, it's my Homegrown Florida Gardening Guide. You can pick it up on my website, homegrownfloridagarden.com. It's also, the link will be down in the description. So we come to the section that talks about pest and disease management. Okay, so it says the most destructive pests affecting squash plants is going to be the squash vine borers, leaf foot bugs, and pickle worms. Those are the most challenging. They can also be affected by aphids, whiteflies, and spider mites. And then the rest of the chapter goes into all the different ways to correct those issues. So let's focus on the ones that are the worst, right? So we're going to go through leaf foot bugs, squash bugs, kind of in the same family, and then we're going to talk about pickle worms, and then vine borers, which kind of have the same solutions. So the biggest problem with some of these pests is they actually, like the squash vine borer, they actually can burrow into the stem of the squash plants. And once they burrow in, they kind of eat the inside of it, and then it causes the plant to die. And they typically do it like right at the base of the plant where it enters into the soil. So there's a few ways to resolve this. Okay, the most least invasive style of taking care of these is going to be to use insect netting and cover the entire plant. That has its downsides, right? So the drawbacks of using netting is, number one, if you're growing a vining variety, that netting could get quite difficult to put up and over the plant. The second thing is you have to remove it every single day. These guys are not like cucumbers. There's cucumbers that are parthenocarpic, meaning that they're self-pollinating. Yeah, squash are not like that. They need pollination. And it's especially important that you have bees that are helping you. You can hand pollinate. We're going to talk about that in a second. But the biggest thing that is going to help you is bringing in pollinators and having bees. Bees like to do their pollination activities kind of in the early morning hours. So if you're not a morning person like me, I am not. I don't want to get up and have to hand pollinate my plants. The other thing to think about is that these flowers only open for like a few hours. They're not open all day. I mean, when you start getting into less sunlight and cooler temperatures, they will open for longer. But typically, once the sun comes up and once it gets warm out, those flowers close. So you really need early morning bee activity. And if you put netting on them, you're going to have to get up super early, pull the netting off at dawn. I'm talking daybreak, so that the bees can come and pollinate, or you can hand pollinate. And then you're going to have to cover it back up before the evening hits. And even that way, you could still get these pests on them, because the pests sometimes, you know, they're not super active during the day, but it is possible that they could get in there and they could get underneath your netting. Your second option, specifically with vine borers, is using aluminum foil, or I've used grafting tape around the base of the stem. Once again, this kind of has some effectiveness and sometimes not. And that's mainly because they can go and they can burrow in different parts of the vine. So if you cover up one spot, they'll just go to another spot. Sometimes as the plant grows, those pieces of aluminum foil and stuff kind of break apart. And then you're fishing out aluminum foil out of your garden for years to come, or grafting tape out of your garden, and that's not the best option. Another option is to partially bury the stem. So what I like to do is, I like for the first part of the plant, whether it's vining or a bush style like this one right behind me, is to partially bury the stem. And I know they tell us don't bury your plants too deeply. This is one example where I don't follow that rule. When it starts growing, I will actually take soil and bunch it up around the base of the plant, so that way I'm covering as much of the stem as possible. It helps it create multiple rooting points, because the squash plants will create roots along the entire stem, especially if it's buried. If it's not buried, sometimes it doesn't do it. It does it a lot with the vining varieties, not so much with the bush varieties. But if you cover up the stem with soil, that helps as well. The other option, which is honestly my preferred option and really the only way that I can get squash to grow here in Florida where we have extreme pest issues, is using something like BT or spinosad. Now I use spinosad or spinoside. I never know how to pronounce that properly. I prefer spinosad over BT, and here's why. So BT is not as widespread of effectiveness across lots of different pests. So it works, but it doesn't work on lots of things. And some people like that because it means it's less dangerous for good pollinators. Whereas spinoside is kind of indiscriminate in its killing powers. And because of that, it can affect good pollinators. But there's the toss-up, right? BT needs to be sprayed about every 5 to 7 days. And if it rains, you need to do it every time it rains. Spinoside, on the other hand, can go anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks, and it doesn't wash off with rain. So I'm applying it less often, which means when it is wet, it is when it is like effective for non-plant chewing pests. So like a bee or a butterfly, if you spray it directly on them, yes, it's going to hurt them. But if it's been allowed to dry and then the bee comes around, it's not going to affect it. It only affects the animals that chew on the actual plant tissue material, which bees and butterflies don't do. So I feel like spraying less often is just going to be less detrimental on those good pollinators. That's my own personal opinion. If you would rather use BT that has a less indiscriminate killing power, that is an option too. But remember, you're gonna have to do that just about every week. The other thing is you need to do that preventatively. Don't wait until you lose a squash plant. Don't wait until you see the worms chewing on the plant or see an entry wound into the stem of the plant. Don't wait. The minute you start to have a plant that's, you know, about a foot tall, that's when I start doing it. So pretty immediate. It can handle it even younger, and I have done it on younger plants. I just think it's like, you know, it's not that important. They're not going after super tiny plants. They're going after bigger plants. I think it's harder for them to find the smaller ones. So I don't start spraying until we reach that point that it's kind of partially mature, especially if it has flowers or fruit, then I'm definitely spraying it. And I'm spraying it on a regular basis. I use my phone's reminder app to tell me when to spray. And then I follow that schedule ongoing until I am done for the season or until the plant starts to succumb to one of the other issues that we're going to talk about. The second tweak we're going to talk about is disease prevention. So what I have growing behind me here is a bunch of tomato plants, but also a bunch of squash plants. And so a way to prevent disease, especially if you have it really bad in your garden, is to grow vining varieties. This is actually a squash, a spaghetti squash. I think it's called angel hair, and it's a vining variety. There's a few zucchini varieties that are also vining varieties. One of my favorites is Tromboncino. We're going to talk about all the varieties later because that's one as well. But growing them up a trellis or vertically allows the leaves to be separated and have some distance so that when it rains or it gets dewy in the morning, that it allows them to air off really, really quickly. Now, your second thing that you need to do is, just like you're on a preventative spraying schedule for the pests, we need to be on a preventative spraying schedule for the disease. It's really hard to cure diseases once they happen. It's a lot easier to prevent them. So you can there's lots of different kinds of sprays, right? There's a milk and water spray, there's a baking soda and water spray, there's copper fungicide that you can buy if you don't want to mix your own. The one that I prescribe to that I absolutely love is going to be the hydrogen peroxide in water. Once I started using that, the amount of disease in my garden has significantly decreased, whether that's these huge tomato plants or whether it's these squash plants behind me. And I use 1 cup hydrogen peroxide, the 3%, the kind that you buy at the drugstore for wound care. That's the kind that I use, and I mix that with 1 gallon of water. Now, the other ones have different ratios, so make sure to check that out, look that up for each one. And if you're going to use milk, I think they like you to use whole fat milk. I have done the milk before. I didn't find it as effective as the hydrogen peroxide. I've never done the baking soda. I did do the copper fungicide. In fact, that's the one that I used almost exclusively for the first 2 years in my garden. And then I did a soil test and realized that the copper in my soil was accumulating. So either I was using it too much or it just accumulates faster than I can, take it out of the soil. So I stopped using it and switched to the hydrogen peroxide. You're gonna wanna spray those products at least once a week, especially after rain. So if you've had a significant amount of rain and the plants have stayed wet for hours and hours and hours, you definitely wanna spray that time, and then you wanna do it weekly. Just get on a regular schedule, just like you do with your pest sprays, and just put it on your phone. It's going to be your best option. Now, it's not going to keep it from happening. I live in Florida, y'all. It is subtropical, meaning it is always wet here. It is humid to the extreme. And so these guys will eventually get the disease. I've never had a squash plant make it through the entire season without getting some powdery mildew. Now, there are varieties that are more resistant, and I definitely stick to those. But if you want to grow all the different varieties, those are still possible, even without strong disease resistance, if you are being preventative with your sprays. The next tweak you can make is all about flowers and how to get your flowers to bloom. Squash plants are incredibly temperamental. They don't want to bloom and put off flowers if it's too hot or it's too cold. Now here in Florida, I don't deal with the too cold situation. Very rarely in the middle of winter, we get a frost and it will take these guys out. But up until that point, I mean, it's usually 70 degrees during the day. So it almost always is flowering. My problem is with the heat. These guys want to flower when it's between 60 and 80 degrees. So if it's colder than 60 degrees, it's not going to want to put off flowers. And if it's hotter than 80 degrees, it's not going to want to put off flowers. Now, there are some varieties that can go in between those two or outside of those temperatures. But for the most part, they don't want to flower, and they don't want to flower successfully until they get into those temperatures. And then the thing is they're going to always put off male flowers first. That is nature doing its fine work. Basically what it's doing is it puts off all these male flowers, like a ton of them. You're going to see a ton of male flowers and you'll be like, why don't I have any females? Yeah, she's trying to attract all the pollinators. So they push off a bunch of male flowers, and it encourages pollinators. They smell, I guess, the pollen, see the pollen, I'm not sure. But they are drawn to the plant with all these male flowers with all this pollen. And then they keep coming back day by day, knowing that this plant is pushing off a bunch of flowers, until one day, about 2 weeks later, it'll push off a female flower, which is what is happening right here. Look at that. You can see the squash on the bottom of that female flower right there. And then the male flowers, hopefully you can see that right there, it doesn't have the little squash at the bottom. A lot of people think that just because there is a squash at the bottom that the flower, that's going to turn into a squash, and that's not necessarily the case. In this case, this little zucchini at the bottom hasn't been pollinated yet. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But in order to get these flowers to open up, you need to have certain, temperatures. So how do you control temperatures, right? You control temperatures by planting your plant at a specific time. So here in Florida, that is usually February to March, depending on if you're in North Florida or South Florida, and then August or September, once again, depending on if you're in North or South Florida. You start in August if you're in the northern side of the state, because you're going to cool off faster. And by the time this plant gets to 60 days old, you're going to be in that 80-degree range, because then you're going to be around October. If you're in a colder climate, if you start your squash too early and start them from seed, and then you're starting them indoors in containers, and you bring them out right after your last frost day, you still might be getting cold temperatures in the evening time, and it's going to make these guys not want to push off flowers. And so you're going to be sitting here with this gigantic, beautiful plant that is going to have just be loved by all the pests and want to contract all the diseases, and then you're just taking care of this big, beautiful plant that's just not putting on flowers because you didn't wait long enough for the temperatures to warm up. So you need to time out your temperatures. And the only way to do this, really, you can look at your last frost date and your first frost date. You can look at your local extension offices. But really, the way that I do it is, if I know the temperature that the plant likes, I just start looking at the temperature fluctuations in my area. So I look up, I'm in Spring Hill, Florida. I look up Spring Hill, Florida by month temperatures, and Google will tell you what the average temperatures are. And once I start to see that I'm about to hit a month that is going to have that 80 degrees or under, then I go, you know what, I need to count backwards 2 months, because you need to give these guys at least 60 days to get to maturity. If I wait too long, then I head into cold temperatures or too hot of temperatures. But that may not be a condition in your place. You might be able to start them much later and deal with them in warmer summer temperatures, where I cannot. I cannot grow squash in summer temperatures. Rare exceptions. There's just like 2 squashes that will grow and flower in super hot temperatures down here. But for the most part, no, and especially not like zucchinis. But let's get into the next little tweak that you can make, and that's going to be around pollination. We touched on it earlier when we talked about the flowers over by the Dunja squash. We just talked about it right here where I showed you that female flower, but now let's talk about it in detail. So if you're having struggles, maybe you have a brand new garden and the pollinators haven't found where you're at. Maybe this squash didn't push off enough male flowers to attract pollinators. You know, you can do a lot of things, right? You need to introduce diversity into your garden. So that's going to be flowers, native plants, fruit trees, you know, all those different kinds of diversity, putting it in between your squash plants, planting, you know, different crops together. So squashes and carrots, just plant everything all mixed up, make it jumbled. They seem to like that in nature. And I guess it's because it mimics nature, right? Because nature doesn't monocrop all squashes. You know, in nature, in a forest, there's a lot of different things growing together. I think it's the same principle. So if you can create that, you can encourage pollinators. Now that doesn't help if you got a plant that's mature size and flowering right now. What you have to do in that case is you have to hand pollinate. So to hand pollinate, you first have to locate a male flower. This can be any male flower. If you're not planning on saving the seeds, you can use male flowers from one variety to pollinate another. And I'm not just talking different zucchini varieties. I'm talking winter squash, summer squash, pumpkins. You can cross-pollinate them. You do not want to save the seeds from those particular varieties because you have created a hybrid. But if you just want to get the food from it, it doesn't matter what pollen you're getting it from. You're going to take it from that male flower, which is just a stem with a flower and the little, I forget the names, stigma? Anyway, it's the little pointy thing on the inside of the male flower. You're going to take a paintbrush, a Q-tip. You can even break the flower off, peel the petals away, and then you're going to find yourself a female flower. I had one here this morning. They close up so fast, you guys. It's right here. You can probably just barely see that. This one is a patty pan squash. And so this squash looks a little bit different right here. I don't know if you can see that, but this squash little fruit on the bottom is a little bit different shaped than the one we looked at earlier where it looks like a straight zucchini. This one is a patty pan zucchini. But it's gonna have the fruit on the bottom, which is a little tiny miniature piece of squash. A lot of people think when they see that means that the squash is pollinated and it's growing, and that is not the case. It will always produce a little piece of fruit underneath a female flower, whether it was pollinated or not. Now, whether you get the male pollen onto the female flowers, move that pollen, is whether or not that little piece of fruit is going to continue to grow or not. If it doesn't get enough pollen or it doesn't get any pollen, then that little female piece of fruit is just going to slowly start to wither away and die. If it does get the pollen, within about 2 days, you're going to see it start to grow, and it grows very, very quickly. It's not like you won't be second guessing it. In 2 days, if your squash is not grown, it didn't get pollinated. It's the easiest way to tell. So once you take that male pollen from the male flower and move it over to the female flower, you just have to brush it along the inside. You don't have to be fancy with it. It doesn't have to be in any special way. Just get that pollen onto that center part of that female flower. I mean, if you can see it on your paintbrush or your Q-tip, it's plenty enough. The ones that I have trouble with is when I'm trying to pollinate or hand pollinate cucumbers or watermelon, because the pollen is so microscopic you can barely see it. Squash plants have enormous amounts of pollen on their male flowers. So it's very easy to see that you have some pollen on your little paintbrush, your Q-tip or whatever, to get it onto the female flower. The last little tweak you can make is all around varieties, and there's a couple reasons for this. You see this guy back here? There's 2 of them actually. There was a third. It got a pickle worm, so we had to take it out. But these are spaghetti squashes, Trivoli. I have found that hybrid squashes are probably the most helpful when it comes to growing squash in climates that don't necessarily grow squash well, like here in Florida. So Trivoli is a hybrid. Dunja is a hybrid. Those two are two of my favorites, but there are some heirlooms. If you're a strictly heirloom grower, gray zucchini has done very well for me. Straight neck crook squash, that one does okay, right? The early prolific straight neck crook squash, that's a yellow squash, it does okay. Not as good as the gray zucchini, and certainly not as good as the Dunja. And then Tromboncino, which is also called Zucchinio ripicante, I believe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. You can see them in either name, but it's Tromboncino squash. It is a very large summer squash. And if you allow it to completely mature, it actually becomes a winter squash, kind of like a butternut squash. Both ways, I've eaten it both ways. I actually prefer it as a summer squash, but the winter squash size of it is pretty good too. But man, is it huge, and it does require a trellis, and a very large trellis at that. But those are some options for you, whether you like to grow heirloom or whether you like to grow hybrids. The other thing is, if you have a lot of pest pressure, you're gonna want to go with a Machada variety. So the Tromboncino is a Machado variety. Another one that you can do is Seminole pumpkin. I know that is technically a winter squash, and we're talking about zucchinis, but any one of these winter squashes, including this right here, this spaghetti squash, that spaghetti squash plant right there has 3 on there, had 3. I took one off the other day because it did get a pickle worm, because I guess I didn't spray that one well enough. And I ate it as a summer squash, because you can do that. With any winter squash you grow, you can eat it as a summer squash. So if the only one that you can grow is Seminole pumpkins, because those grow down here in the heat with the disease, all the things, right? It's basically bomb-proof. You can eat that one as a summer squash. You don't have to let it go to maturity. Catch it when it's young, and then you can take it off and eat it like a zucchini. So you have a lot of choices here, but a Machada variety, whether that's the Seminole pumpkin or the Tromboncino squash, they have a different style stem. The stem is kind of like more solid. It's not hollow. So if you've ever cut the leaves off of a squash plant, you know that the stems are kind of hollow. And that's what the squash vine borers really like, when they burrow in and they kind of eat their way through. Well, this one, it's not, it's solid, so that they can't really eat very well through. And then it also roots at different points. These are all Machada varieties. Some of them are vining. I'm not sure of a lot of them that are bush. They're almost exclusively vining plants. I grew South Anna butternut squash, which is a Machada. I grew Thai King Cobb, which is a Machada variety. All of them have done exceptionally well for me. They flower in the heat. They're pretty disease resistant, some more than others. A lot of them are heirlooms, and they handle the squash vine borers. So a lot of them aren't typical, though. What you're going to see is a lot of them aren't things that you're used to seeing. They're odd-looking pumpkins or odd-looking squashes, but they taste just as good as a typical zucchini or typical spaghetti squash or whatever. So branch out and try some different varieties. Look for people in your area that are growing specific varieties, or that farms are growing specific varieties, and try to find some like that. But if you want to go with hybrids, I really like Johnny seeds. That's where I get my Dunja squash, and that's what I grow almost exclusively as a summer squash. But I've gotten into the gray zucchini and the Tromboncino before, and those are all very exceptional. I think the gray zucchini gives the Dunja a run for its money. The Tromboncino, the only reason why I don't grow that one more is because, one, it just takes up a lot of space. I only have one arch trellis, and it really needs that arch trellis in order to grow. And I typically grow those during the summer if I want to, because there's not a lot of things that will grow here in during the summer, and Tromboncino will. So I don't want it to take up my precious vertical space during our prime growing season in fall, which is why it's not growing right now. But you totally could if you're really, oh, and also it's going to give you enormous amounts. Each one of these things feeds a family of like 12. It's crazy. And then they put off so many. So you get a crazy amount. You got to know what you want to do with that much squash. So there's a little things to take into account there. It's a great problem to have. But with these 5 little tweaks that you make, putting pest management on a schedule, putting disease management on a schedule, hand pollinating, getting the right varieties and planting them at the right times, you can expect to have a very, very nice zucchini harvest. Head down in the comments, let me know which one of these is your biggest struggle with growing zucchinis and which one you are going to try this year. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today in the garden. Happy gardening.